Is something that one of my undergraduate students did last year. And as part of our whole study program, we're interested in looking at the health and welfare of the animal, but particularly at this stage, the physical health. And if some of you were at the discussion session earlier on, we were talking about taking dust out of the forage and out of the bedding, and finding a way in which we can improve the environment in which the horse lives, but particularly for the respiratory health. And so this study evolved out of that, and we're looking at the effect of stable design and the way in which people look after horses to see if that has any effect on the respirable particles in the environment. So dust in the stable environment can cause respiratory problems in horses. Now, horses don't just cough like we do just to clear their throats. If a horse coughs, he has got a serious problem. There is something going on in the lungs there that is actually causing him to cough. That is not just a simple reflex reaction like it is with us. So he's either got a virus or he's starting up getting some sort of respiratory disorder. And these respiratory disorders are the ones that we're particularly interested in, looking at things such as recurrent airways disorder, which is an allergy. It's very akin to human asthma. And this particular condition is caused by these respirable particles. And these particles are very, very small. In fact, when you shake the hay, you can't actually see them. The dust you see is bigger than that. So it's not the dust that you see that's the problem. It's the dust that you don't see, but it is there. And it comes from organic sources, particularly from hay and straw. And it causes this condition, recurrent airway disorder. Now, this is basically non-reversible in horses when they get to this stage. At the early stages, you can improve it, but you do lose quite a lot of elasticity of the lungs. So you really don't want to put your horse in this condition at all. Quite a lot of people say to us in the United Kingdom, well, I don't have a problem with my horse. And I always say, no, not yet. But an allergy is a response to continued exposure to dust. One of the things that we're looking at as well is that this dust level is influenced by the management regime. So how do you manage your forage and your bedding, and under what conditions? We've heard quite a lot about ventilation. Under what conditions do you try and manage that dust and keep it out of the horse's environment? So we're looking at different types of forage and bedding. We also thought ventilation rate, as we've heard, is very important, but so are horse care activities. What you do around the horse can create a lot of dust. And so sweeping activities, grooming, mucking out, that sort of thing, can expose the horse to unacceptable levels of dust. So we wanted to find out what similar activities within two types of stabling and what impact that had on the dust in the stable environment. So we took two very commonly used systems. We have an American barn system where the horses have a big airspace, but it's a shared airspace. And then you have a typical single box. This is a stable in Normandy, so I did get a French stable for you. And the horse has its own airspace, but it is a little bit limited. And the objective of this study was to investigate the relationship between respirable particles in the breathing zone and in the stable zone on different management regimes, and then at the same time look at the influence that different management regimes had on the dust levels in American barns versus single box housing systems. So we were looking at two aspects in this study. So we took 38 stables in 10 different American barns and sampled them, and 34 stables in 9 different straight stable block designs. And we took respirable particles using this little cyclone sampler, which actually separates the dust that you see, the bigger dust, from the small dust, the 5 micron and less size particles. And we used this dust sampler, both, as you can see in this picture here, to look at what the horse is being exposed to in his breathing zone. And then we took it off the head collar and literally stood with the horse in the stable doing his normal activities and took a sample of the general stable air. These horses were on 4 different management regimes. They were on steamed hay and shavings, Now, it's quite important, I have just spoken a little bit about this particular machine, but it's important to understand that this is simply not just steaming in a bucket. This is actually proper steaming of the hay, where you get rid of all the respirable particles and you kill all the microbes. If you partially steam, you don't do that. So this is not just somebody pouring a kettle of hot water on it, this is proper steaming. And these horses were on shavings. Then we also looked at dry hay and shavings. Then we had haylage and straw. Now, haylage is very popular in the UK. I don't know if it's quite so popular here in France, but it's regarded as it's a low-dust forage. It's not a dust-free forage. It's a low-dust forage. And then we looked at the very traditional system of dry hay and straw. The data was analysed. This is just a picture of the particles that you see down the microscope. And that's why I have students to do that sort of thing. They sit and count respirable particles down a microscope. And so we calculated the number of respirable particles per litre of air, and then we analysed the data using a Wilcoxon matched pairs test for both the stable design and then looking at the stable zone, so looking at the breathing zone and the stable zone. And the differences were set at 0.05. So here is a summary of what the first part of the results, and the table looks a little bit complicated, but if we just really highlight the red area, you can see that with steamed hay and shavings we had no significant difference between the stable zone or the breathing zone in American barns, or indeed the same two zones within single stables. But when we looked at dry hay and shavings, we found that you get significantly more particles in the breathing zone of the horse because it's on dry hay. Now, that's not rocket science. I'm not telling you something that you probably don't know, but you've got to think about this where you take the sample of dust. Lots of people now go around stables, they take dust samples, and they say, I've got the horse on this regime, take a sample of dust. It's where the horse has his nose is what counts. That is what he's breathing. So it's important to understand that. And the same thing happened in single stables, is there was significantly more dust when they were fed dry hay. Even if their general environment is cleaner, if the hay is dry, they're breathing in a lot of dust. The opposite then, not unexpected, but the opposite, I was quite surprised at the extent of this difference, actually, in that when you had straw in the stable, in the bedding, we got significantly more dust in the general breathing zone. Now, that is also a problem in the fact that the horse does spend quite a lot of time in the general breathing zone as well, because it's not eating all of the time. So significantly more dust in the stable zone, both in single stables and in the American barn system. Dry hay and straw, you can see from the number of particles, very, very dirty altogether. So you are subjecting your horse to a lot of respirable particles and the potential to come up with a respiratory disorder, an allergic respiratory disorder, if you feed dry hay and you bed on straw. It's a fact. When we looked at the stable zone, then looking across both the American barns and straight stables, we found very little difference between steamed hay and shavings across, between the two stable types, or indeed the dry hay and shavings. But again, when we looked at the haylage and straw, we found there was significantly more dust in straight stables in the stable zone when you bedded the horse on straw. Now, again, that's because of the limited airspace, that the dust that the horse is walking around the stable and he's kicking up the dust and it doesn't clear out as quickly, so he's breathing this in all the time. When we looked at dry hay and straw then, in both of these different stable types, looking at comparing the two stable types in the stable zone, the dry hay and straw was significantly more in the American barn than in the straight system. So when you actually have straw within a shared airspace, what is happening essentially is, and it's the same within the breathing zone as well, is that all of that dust from everybody else's stable is going into your airspace. And so this is why when you have an American barn system, it's very important, if you have a horse with respiratory disorder, either you take him out of the American barn if you've got other people fed dry hay and stabled on straw, or you change all the boxes onto shavings, onto a low dust regime, onto steamed hay and shavings, because that one stable will contaminate the air. Now, when you're in a single boxer, that doesn't happen quite so much. But within an American barn system, it's no good having 5 horses on a dust regime, and you've got one at the bottom there, and he's still on straw and dry hay, because that will contaminate the rest of the environment. So steamed hay and shavings actually causes the lowest dust across both the stable types. The dust in the stable zone, not surprising, is more influenced by the bedding, and the dust in the breathing zone is more influenced by the forage. But straw, actually, bedding on straw puts more dust in both zones than bedding on shavings. It's just simply because the horse kicks it up all the time. Dry hay equals more dust in the breathing zone, as you would expect, but it's less than if the horse is bedded on straw as well, then you're compounding the problem, you're making it worse. Dry hay and shavings gives you the second highest level of dust, so again, all the time thinking about the dust that's in the breathing zone is the most important. There's more dust in the stable zone of single stables when straw is used because there's a lower clearance rate, but dry hay and straw is worse in both environments, but particularly in an American barn system. So I think you have to be very aware of the cross-contamination that is happening because they're sharing the dust. So in conclusion, the steamed hay and shavings is the best regime overall. A low dust bedding or a low dust forage will only partially reduce the potentially allergenic dust in the stable. So there's no good going halfway. You have to go the whole step. And okay, shavings are a little bit more expensive than straw, but you only have to have 1 or 2 visits from the vet and you've made up that difference in cost. So dry hay and straw produces a poor environment in both stable types, but it's particularly bad in the American barn system. And I'd just like to thank the owners who let us go into their stables and take samples, and the Royal Agricultural University who sponsored my student to do this trial. Thank you for your attention.